Just giving it a second to start streaming. Just giving it a second to start. Just giving everyone a moment to trickle in, and we'll get started in just a minute. Okay, I think we can get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Audrey Bolus, and I'm the Senior Programs and Communications Associate at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, also known as TIMEP. It's my pleasure to welcome you to our newest virtual panel, Gender and Press Freedom, examining Morocco, Tunisia, and Algeria. Across the Maghreb region of North Africa, in Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia, governments have escalated restrictions on freedom of expression and created an increasingly hostile environment for media and the press in recent years. In all three countries, journalists have faced arrest, media platforms have been censored, and the space for expression online and offline has become more constrained as cybercrime and social media laws continue to be passed. This is especially the case for women journalists who have been the targets of particularly gendered attacks that aim to intimidate and silence them due to their work. We at TIMEP are privileged to host a conversation on gender and press freedom in the Maghreb today that will explore the unique impacts of press freedom restrictions and crackdowns on women, as well as some of the tactics used specifically against women journalists. Before we begin, I want to remind our audience of a few things. As always, today's conversation is being recorded and will be shared widely after the panel. You can follow along and live tweet with us using the hashtag TIMEPevents. And we invite our audience to submit questions using Zoom's Q&A function at any time. Without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce today's wonderful moderator, Inès Osman. Inès is a French-Algerian human rights lawyer and the co-founder and executive director of MENA Rights Group, a legal advocacy NGO which defends and promotes fundamental rights and freedoms in the Middle East and North Africa. Inès, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for the introduction, and thanks again to TIMEP for hosting this very important and I hope interesting conversation we're going to be having today. I'm really pleased to be joined by Samia Errazzouki, who is a non-resident fellow at TIMEP, who focuses on press freedom in North Africa with a special emphasis on the situation of women journalists. She's also the co-founder of Khmisa, an NGO that advocates for women's rights in Morocco through an intersectional lens. I'm also pleased to be joined by Sherif Mansour, who is an Egyptian-American democracy and human rights activist, and also the Middle East and North Africa program coordinator with the Committee to Protect Journalists, CPJ. And last but not least, we're also joined by Jeje Mohamed, who is the Senior Manager for Digital Safety and Free Expression at PEN America. Jeje has over 9 years of experience working on human rights issues, journalism, safety and security in the Middle East and internationally. Without further ado, I want to start by setting the scene and discussing a little bit the context in the Maghreb region. So, Samia, starting with you and having seen authoritarian regression in the Maghreb region, what are some of the drivers of these crackdowns, and what is the significance of looking at this pervasive problem from a gender lens specifically? Samia, are you still with us? Perhaps if she's having some connection problems, she will join us a bit later. And in the meantime, Sherif, perhaps you can start. And perhaps I want to ask you about some of the things that you've been working on at CPJ regarding the documentation of the rise of surveillance to target journalists, especially in the last several years. Could you tell us what kind of surveillance technology do some of these states have access to, and how does it work? How does it impact the work of journalists on the ground? You are still muted.
Thank you, Inès, and thank you for Tahrir Institute for the invite. I hope Samia can join us soon. I would say this is probably one of the worst development we've seen across the Middle East in terms of censorship. We are a region that's known to be one of the most censored in the world, but we've seen that manifest itself in cases where journalists have been killed. The Middle East is one of every 3 journalists worldwide killed, according to our work at CPJ, died in the Middle East, but also manifested in imprisonment. And you will see, for example, that in the region, the rise of imprisonment have happened mainly over the last 10 years because of protests, but covering them, but more and more because of criticizing the government on issues that has to do with their handling of terrorism. It just has to do even with handling the pandemic recently, and more about corruption. And that I think we have a lot of example from Morocco and the Maghreb region, for example. You also see that the censorship factor appears as one of a campaign that the governments in these regions have launched. So the people would be surveilled, but they're also prosecuted legally because of their work, or use other threats, including smear campaigns, online campaigns, to try to silence them. We also see more and more transnational oppression that also happens against exiled journalists, including Samia, outside of Morocco, and including myself. And surveillance was always one of the ways that these governments have tried to go after critics abroad. And they have used technologies now imported from Israel, and some that even supported by Gulf countries in recent years. I see Samia is back, so I'll yield the floor.
I'm very sorry about that. I don't have internet connection, so I'm using a hotspot. But to answer Inez's question earlier, what we're seeing in the Maghreb is a steady decline in press freedom, human rights, and liberties in general. This is across the board in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. Perhaps the starting point in Morocco could be pointed to 2017 with the rise of the Hirak protests in the northern Rif region, which marked the beginning of a number of journalists facing arrest, leading to the culmination of the shuttering of the last independent news publication in Morocco. Same with Tunisia a few years later, once we saw Tunisian President Kais Saied consolidate power in a very unprecedented way, sparking widespread condemnation from Tunisians and the international community. What followed suit in response to protests against measures he took, in addition to the coverage of boycotting elections and the referendum, Tunisian journalists facing arbitrary detention and arrest, oftentimes under the guise of national security. And then similarly, again, in Algeria, we have seen steady erosion of press freedom, with most recently, within the past few weeks and months, a number of Algerian journalists facing arrest. Again, widely condemned by Algerians and the international community, including the shuttering of independent publications. We are seeing this common thread that is, for once, tying these 3 countries that are oftentimes defined as being very diverse and different in how they approach their domestic policies, as sharing a very common thread, which is they have found this unity in how they have approached press freedom. Now, when it comes to the question of women, what we oftentimes don't see behind the indicators that are published in international publications and rights groups is just because women are not in particular immediate danger, such as, their lives or facing arrest, does not mean that they are not exempt from various forms of oppression that target them because of their work and because of their gender. And so I'm not sure what was covered in the brief moment that I dropped, but this is, I think, sort of what sets up the picture for today to understand that women journalists in the Maghreb are facing a particularly unique set of circumstances that are impeding them from their work, pushing them out of the field of journalism, which is creating a massive space and gap of information and access to information that is extremely critical for not just those of us that work in the field, but for societies in general in the Maghreb more broadly.
Thank you so much, Samia, and thank you, Sherif, for so kindly dropping your comments to allow Samia back in. I don't know if you wanted to make further remarks, Sherif, on the issue of surveillance, or if you would like me to pass it on to Jeje.
We can cover it later. I think the impact that I wanted to do, including from censorship, has to do with the broader principle of privacy. And this is very important for gender, it's very important for freedom of information and for democracy itself. We rely on people having the privacy of their mind, the privacy of their communication, in order to talk to and find critical and sensitive information for the general public. That's how we have informed citizenry. And when we don't have that, then we deny journalists, we deny activists, we deny every human being their freedom. I'll stop here and I'll leave it to Jeje.
Thank you so much, Sherif. So Jeje, actually, you were previously working as a journalist covering human rights abuses in Egypt, and now at PEN America, you frequently work with women and women journalists on safety and security issues. Can you share with us about your personal experience as a woman journalist and some of the obstacles that the women you are working with are also facing?
Sure. Thank you so much. And thank you, TIMEP, for having me with you in this amazing panel with these amazing people. Just to add to the same conversation and the same points that Sherif and Samia talked about, when we talk about online abuse, it's a discussion that doesn't only live in a computer or within like a platform. The problem with online abuse is that it has a chilling effect on freedom of expression and freedom of the press. So we saw that, like, I know that we're going to discuss later a lot of the aspects on how online abuse affects people and journalists, specifically women journalists. But being a woman journalist in the Middle East, it's a very tough job for multiple reasons. One of it, that you are not actually welcomed in the field, whether culturally or because of political reasons. It depends on the specific cultural atmosphere that you have in the country. But also, like as Samia mentioned, women journalists have different layers of obstacles while doing their jobs. And for me personally, the attacks and the threats weren't only in a on an online sphere, but the problem that it could start online and then transfers offline to physical threats and threats of sexual abuse, threats of physical abuse and stuff like that. So when we're discussing the issue, I really always make sure to highlight that when we're talking about safety and security, it's not that we're talking about physical safety, online safety, and like mental health. It's all interconnected, and it should be discussed as a holistic approach, because when you're siloing each of it, it actually puts people in danger more. And in the context, like, I know I'm an Egyptian journalist and a safety and security advisor, but when we're talking about online abuse in the world, and then in North Africa and in different countries, the internet has no borders. And a tactic of abuse, let's say it starts in the US, it takes a couple of months, maybe, or maybe less, so that we witness it in other countries in the Middle East, for example. The way it's used, again, as journalists, and specifically women journalists, differs depending on the the technology or the resources that the actors have. Online abuse doesn't have to happen only from different groups. It can happen from governments. And in this one, like government-sponsored attacks and online abuse. And it all has similar purposes: to silence people, to push women out of the industry, and to cover the truth. I can continue on and on, but I want to give space.
Thank you so much, Jeje. And yeah, thank you to both you and Samia as well for sharing your personal experiences. And I think you both as women journalists have also faced a lot of the obstacles that we're talking about. And hopefully we'll also talk later about ways to address it and what could be done moving forward. I would like now to go a little bit deeper into specific tactics that are being used against women journalists, and perhaps also specific like cases and examples of like personal situations that you know of or you yourself have faced. So Sherif, back to you. Could you tell us a little bit about the legal framework that actually allows these abuses to take place? Like, how is the law being weaponized against journalists, and how are women being affected in particular?
So the Middle East has countries with full arsenals of censorship laws, and they are included even in constitution when it has to do with something like fighting terrorism, but also libel defamation, criminalizing even insults against government, and more morality clauses that appears even in the most open-minded governments. Usually even Gulf countries will try to show that they are becoming more and more into women's rights in public, and as a tactic to kind of silence criticism on their human rights record and press freedom record overall. And we've seen that pushed to the limit, for example, in Morocco, where the government has weaponized women's rights. In our investigation, for example, in cases, the 3 journalists that we've had jailed in Morocco for years are all jailed because of sexual charges. They have invented and adapted parts in the penal code that has to do with legitimate concerns for women's rights that could be seen as the government implementing the law. But in practice, they are abusing the political process, the legal process, by denying rule of law to even those journalists. And we and others have documented how they have not had the basic standards for fair trial. They were abused during their detention, and even the women that have been used as witnesses. We've seen the pressures, the smear campaigns by governments, pro-governments, media that accompanied the case over years that shows that this was an abuse of law in the name of implementing law. And I think overall, if you're talking about cases in which the government have abused law, absolutely terrorism charges across the region is now codified. You will see that the government use this kind of national security in Algeria all the time, undermining national unity or the army or government institution. About things that has to do with just basic journalism work, covering protests, even some protests that has to do with women's rights across the region. We see the same thing in Tunisia, where also the detentions are being justified outside the law. The government tries to also more recently remove protections that we had in Tunisia for years under the law that denies, pretrial detention and other ways to silence and punish criticism and independence ahead of time, enforce censorship ahead of time. There is, of course, a whole kind of other society-based factors that also are more gender-specific. And I think in many ways, people can say that we don't see women jailed in North Africa, for example. There are no cases of women journalists in jail, but that doesn't mean they are not happening. It means that there are more broader constraints like self-censorship, which happen after the damage has already been done, after the prosecutions, undermining rule of law, lack of protection in government, in law, and institution are not provided, then most would just censor themselves. Most would not even try. And I think this is a situation that happens every day that we cannot cover in our annual reports, or would be hard to report on without risks. I'll stop here too. I'll come back. We have a next round.
I would like to add one more thing to what Sherif was talking about. One of the things is that I'm focusing now more on online abuse and gendered attacks online. And there is a lack worldwide of protection when it comes to online abuse, and a lack of understanding of how to tackle cases, how to document cases, how to, for example, like we work with journalists a lot on like documenting the abuse that they're receiving, so that if at a point in life they decide to seek any legal support, they have evidence. But the problem is internationally, actually, there is a lack of legal framework that would support journalists doing that, or understanding the actual threats that comes with online abuse. And if that's worldwide, the Middle East and North Africa is another level that, like, as Sherif talked earlier, it's actually a lot of it is constrained by the different laws and regulations that we have in place to actually suppress freedom of expression. But even if we try to solve the bigger picture when it comes to other things that you are allowed as a journalist to criticize, this is actually your job. You're allowed to cover something that the government is not happy about. But there is another level that we will need to discuss at a point. I really hope it's near future. I doubt it, but I hope it's near future, that how can we integrate protections for journalists when it comes to online presence and discourse from being retaliated against from governments.
Thank you so much, Jeje, for jumping in. And if I may, I actually have a follow-up question to Sherif. So you mentioned that countries like are using, let's say, a variety of laws to crack down on journalists. So the counterterrorism law, morality laws, defamation laws. But do you feel like there is a shift towards a more like national security kind of discourse? Like, and yeah, perhaps if anyone else has some thoughts on that, but I'm just curious if you see these as like all the tools that they're using, or if there is definitely a shift and a heavier kind of weight on national security pretext, let's say, to crack down on journalists in recent years or in recent months.
Yes, we call that anti-state charges. That includes anti-terrorism, national security charges. They are not new, and our region, I think, have existed for a long time, but it's becoming more of one of the tactics as well. These governments say, "Oh, don't talk to us. We have a terrorism problem. We're fighting terrorism." And once terrorism is invoked, yes, there are protections. And then they'll say inciting violence. These people are inciting violence, divisions. And of course, these are things that are critically debated when we're talking about human rights as a reference. And also there are principles that have developed within the UN and legal framework all over the world. But some of it is new. So, if we're talking about surveillance, they say we're going to buy these surveillance tools because we're going to use it against terrorists. But then no one monitors how they do it. No one punishing them when they actually abuse it. So I think the response here is a little positive, finally, after a few years. And this didn't happen, just because the governments around the world have realized that how difficult it is. It's just because they themselves as government and policymakers have faced firsthand being surveilled on. Like we said yesterday, the Biden administration announced at the same time that they're saying, finally, we're going to do a moratorium on spyware abuse. It's because 50 federal government employees around the world have faced. We've been telling them it's not just government, it's journalists, it's activists, it's the whole environment. But it took the UN to ask for that moratorium 2 years ago. It took the EU to ask and implement rules of exports a year ago. And then the US finally, yesterday, enforcing it to become a norm. That's after the surveillance software have been used in, if we talk about the Pegasus project, 180 journalists all over the world, more than 45 countries all over the world, including Morocco and North Africa and many in our region. So yes, this is something that could be challenged and could be used within a balanced approach if there was a will, but also if there was a will from the international community to act. We're just seeing one example, but if we see half of the investment by policymakers we've seen on surveillance, I think we can have a lot to do. But it's not just governments, it's social media companies, for example, who have to interpret the laws. They too have to grapple with what is terrorism, what is inciting of violence, what is protection needed for journalists or women journalists and other vulnerable minority communities online. And I think they can do a much better job in order to play that role. I'll not go into examples, but you can see the same level that Jeje talked about, the restrictions that is enforced in reality by governments or societal norms. It's now being enforced by social media companies by just not enforcing the rules or basically messing up the rules. So I think the challenge there is going to be continuing. It's going to be, unfortunately, a lot more worse for people like women, people with who are LGBTQ and other minorities to exist and do their job in real world and online.
Thank you so much, Sherif. Jeje, I want to go back to you a little bit. You did start to touch upon what exactly is online abuse, what are the different tactics that are being used. As was said previously, when it comes to women, it's a bit harder to see the scale of the issue because, as we said before, there are not necessarily many imprisoned women journalists, etc. So could you help us, understand like how are women being attacked online? What does it look like? And perhaps if you can give us some elements of, the scales, like I wonder if you have any perhaps numbers or just what it looks like, since we can't really see that much from the outside.
Of course, thank you so much. And something important that you and Sherif just mentioned is that, yes, we might not have women journalists in jail, or we might, and we don't know the numbers yet, but like even if, as a journalist, the risk that you face doesn't necessarily have to be a physical threat. It can be online. Like, for example, if I am a journalist and I'm receiving a threat of physical violence against me, my family, and my friends, it's fair that I don't want to do this anymore because, like, I am concerned not only for my own safety, but for the safety of others around me. And we see this tactic used a lot of attacking and threatening family members and friends. And then the way we define online abuse, you can call it online abuse, cyber harassment, cyber abuse, but the way we define it is that it's the repeated or severe targeting of an individual or group online through harmful behavior. And in this definition, we have a couple of important words that we chose for this definition. The first thing is it's for harmful behavior. It's not well-intentioned at all, and it is in bad faith. And the other two aspects of the definition is the repeated and severe. And when we say severe, meaning that it could be only one incident of abuse that has catastrophic consequences for an individual. For example, doxing. And doxing is the publishing of personal sensitive information without my consent. That can be my home address, the school of like someone's children, my personal phone number and email, and asking others to harass and harm me. It's one incident. Like we worked with journalists who have struggled with online abuse once through the course of their career, but because of something like that, someone publishing my home address, telling others where I live, asking them to go harm me, this is something really terrifying. And this goes to the severe part of the definition. And then we talk about repeated, because it's very important to mention that it doesn't have to be something as terrifying as doxing to be counted as abuse. Sometimes, and we see this tactic used a lot, it's the volume of the things that I'm receiving is actually counts as online abuse. And this something, for example, there is a tactic called message bombing. And in this one, and I know that it happens a lot in the Middle East, is that someone subscribes me in whether porn sites or useless email lists and stuff like that, or someone sending me hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of messages and phone calls to the point that I cannot have access to my device or to my accounts. And this counts as abuse for several reasons. If you, like, who of us now do not depend on their phones or devices to do every single thing in their day, whether connect with work, whether connect with emergencies needed, connect with their banks, connect to anything when it comes to healthcare, everything, to our families, we use our devices. So if someone is deliberately sending you hundreds of messages to hinder access to your device or to important information in your accounts, that count as abuse. And there are several tactics that are used, and I'm going to mention some of them because, like, if we're going to talk about all of the tactics, it's going to take us hours. The first thing is hate speech, and we see it happening. It's very self-explanatory, but it targets the identity or the intersectional identities of an individual. And as Sherif mentioned earlier, not everyone is targeted for the same reason or in the same way. Being a journalist is targeted as a whole, as a career, you're targeted because of the work that you're doing, because of the coverage that you're doing. But depending on who you are as a journalist, that adds layers and layers of abuse as well. If you're a woman, if you are part of any marginalized group, whether ethnic, race, or sexually or gender, you are also facing other levels of abuse. And when it comes to hate speech, the target or the person targets the identity or the perceived identities of the person they want to harm. Then we have threats. It's normally threats of physical violence. And in the case of women or non-binary individuals, it's mostly threats of physical and sexual violence as well. Then we have cyber mobs. And cyber mobs is a tricky thing to talk about because from the outside, it seems like a random group of people, like just randomly talking about someone or abusing someone online. But it actually isn't random. It is targeted, it is coordinated, and they all pile on an individual and attack them, harass them, or abuse them online. So it's not really random, but from the outside, it can seem random. Then we have doxing, which I mentioned earlier. Another tactic that we're witnessing and seeing increasing a lot, it's in online impersonations. And with this tactic, a group of people, someone pretends to be me, take my picture, take my name, and create a fake account, pretending to be me. And they publish horrific things, horrible things, whether to get me in trouble, whether to get me fired, whether to discredit me as a journalist, or to put me in trouble with specific groups online. That's, for example, if I am covering, like previously I used to cover human rights abuses in Egypt and in the Middle East. And if someone wants to put me in another level of risk, they would impersonate me and publish things about a separate group that is powerful just to put me in trouble, and publish things that this group would get angry at me and attack me. So you get this attack from different actors. Then we have non-consensual intimate imagery, and we see it also happening in North Africa a lot with women journalists specifically. And it's the publishing of fake or manufactured or actual true images without the consent of the person. And it's also to discredit I just want to keep reiterating that a lot of these things are to push people out of the industry, to push women out of the industry, to silence them and to discredit them as a journalist, specifically when it comes to any cultural sensitivities about topics in the region. Then we have, for statistics, you asked me about some numbers. There was a survey done by ICFJ and UNESCO that surveyed women journalists globally. It's not only in the MENA region, but like globally. And 73% of respondents, women respondents, said that they have experienced online violence in the course of their work. 73%. 20% of these women said that the attack or the abuse that happened online have transferred and shifted to offline violence in person. And then 38% said that they made themselves less visible online, which is also, again, it's what people or trolls online want to do. Then we have 13% of these respondents said that they received threats of violence against those who are close to them, family members, friends, and partners. And then we have 30% of them said that they have self-censored on social media. And I have worked with so many journalists who whether decided to leave social media or just not to publish any of their work that they would seem or feel that might actually trigger abuse. One last addition before I stop talking. One of the things that we get asked a lot is, for example, what topics do I cover not to get abused online? And honestly, there is no answer to that. Yes, some topics are very visible that they might anger people online, but you have other topics, for example, that you would assume that they are not really like, you know, in like cause conflict or anything, but they actually trigger a lot of abuse online. We found that a lot of women journalists covering sports and entertainment are targeted by online abuse. We found that, which is like, this is actually a very weird story, but like I was working with journalists not in the Middle East, this story is not in the Middle East, but the newsroom told us that one of the reporters, or a lot of the reporters that they faced abuse at that period were the reporters who covered the Queen's death, which is like, it's not something I would have never assumed that would be a concern at all. But like the topics itself, yes, some of them are very visible, that they would be like a topic that people would get angry about, but others, no.
Thank you so much, Jeje, for sharing these comprehensive and very worrying trends and tactics that are being used against women. Samia, I want to turn back to you and actually ask you if there are any examples of how a journalist has been affected by a combination of some of these tactics. Perhaps you can speak about some of the personal situations that you've come across with, and perhaps I'm following up to what Jeje has been saying. I'm wondering if you could also speak about, like, I'm curious to what extent some of those attacks are state-sponsored and some are more, run by just like, let's say, random individuals. This is something that I think we see a lot, like in the Gulf countries, for example, that you really have like state-sponsored attacks on social media. And I'm just curious to know in the Maghreb, like how that works and how we can sort of differentiate both, or how, those two kind of dynamics like come together.
Of course, I mean, maybe I'll respond with the reverse order. I do know, at least in the case of Morocco, Facebook within the past year or two released a report on removing inauthentic user accounts. Coordinated, I think in Morocco, it was over 300 accounts that were tied to inauthentic behavior online, all of whom were simultaneously promoting state, views, state officials, applauding and praising state officials, while at the same time engaging in abuse, not just of women or journalists, but of any critics of the state. So that's perhaps the closest we'll ever get to an actual confirmation of state-coordinated online activity, with the exception of a few cases that we have seen outside of the Maghreb. But in terms of the Maghreb, that's sort of the closest that we have seen. And, you know, in terms of specific cases, so much of what Sherif and Jeje said resonate with my own experience. Actually, as a former journalist, I have also been subjected to surveillance and harassment online and in person, which prompted me eventually to leave the field. But beyond that, there's been so many other cases that have been documented that have not, that we have seen come to light. From the most extreme, the one that most immediately comes to mind, again, Morocco, I think, gives us this example of all of these factors combined into one, just because Morocco is at the forefront of using surveillance for the purpose of gathering information that is sensitive in order to silence and intimidate critics. And the way that they use this against women is particularly gendered. One of the examples of this is the case of Moroccan journalist Tahrir Institute, who was arrested the moment she stepped out of a gynecological clinic. And the immediate charge against her was the allegation of abortion. She was forced to undergo an invasive gynecological procedure against her will, which she categorized as a state-sanctioned rape. Now, if we compound these ideas back, so surveillance, how did they know that she was there? And then to publish information about her arrest. What was she doing there exactly? Invading her medical privacy, right? And then also the harassment that she was facing. She continues to face now that she has left the country, even though still. Now this case happened back in 2019. This is the other thing, is her case and so many others. Another that comes to mind, again, to not harp on too much on Morocco, but it's just sort of the one that's with the front lines of this. Who isn't also necessarily a journalist, but a woman, Wahiba Kharshish, a former Moroccan police officer, who was surveilled in a hotel room, and images of her in an intimate setting were published on websites and social media accounts. Another example of an activist, Karima Nadir, who was a single mother who had the birth certificate of her child, her underage child, published online as a way to silence her and intimidate her. These are compounding sort of elements and tactics used to silence women in societies that view them in a very conservative light, right? We're dealing with societies in which you as a woman are having to deal with very sort of conservative values that dictate your public presence. The worrying thing that I see is Morocco sort of trailblazing in these tactics, and we're starting to see Algeria and Tunisia take note. And this is something that extends beyond this, the realm of silencing and limiting press freedom, right? There is obviously some sort of a manual that they're taking note from one another, because we're seeing a common thread and tactics and how all of these three states, who, as we will discuss in a bit, have all recently undergone the Universal Periodic Review with the United Nations. And sort of the more recent example that I can think of, not particularly a journalist, but a woman activist, Amira Boughawi, who's Algerian, who fled to Tunisia, and then through Tunisia fled to France, where she has requested asylum, and she was sentenced to 3 months in absentia in Tunisia. She has also been the sort of target of online defamation, harassment, allegations, you know, spanning from the most wild conspiracy theories. But we know that she fled because of the charges that she was facing due to her involvement in protests in Algeria. That's another tactic that we're seeing, is sort of the shifting in the geopolitics in the Maghreb, which have sort of placed Tunisia in this sort of more close relationship with Algeria compared to the past, likely, you know, around this question of gas and energy resources, which is a little bit tangential, but we can get to it later if there are any questions. But the shifting dynamics have also created a huge impact on the safety of women on the ground, whereas Tunisia used to be a very relatively safe place for journalists and activists who are fleeing their home countries due to pressure, harassment, and, you know, used to have a relatively safe space to live, at least just on a fundamental basic level, no longer have that in Tunisia. Now in Tunisia, we're seeing the authorities act on the behest and on behalf of, you know, the Algerian authorities or the Moroccan authorities to enact pressure and actually continue pursuing charges against women. So these are just sort of a few examples. And I'm happy to sort of delve into the more broader geopolitical context. But I think one of the reasons why we're having this conversation right now is so often in response to critics and international rights groups, Algerian, Moroccan, and Tunisian governments are really good at deflecting blame and pointing to one another. This is especially the case between Morocco and Algeria. But I think the purpose of this conversation is to say, well, let's take a step back and see, in fact, there's a lot of commonality here. And just because, Morocco and Algeria are notoriously, not good friends doesn't necessarily mean that they're not adopting the same tactics and creating the same circumstances for journalists in their countries, for women journalists, but also for foreign journalists, local journalists who are across the board. It's an abysmal and really difficult time to work as a journalist in the Maghreb.
Thank you so much, Samia. And indeed, perhaps this is something we can go back to later, but it's cause for concern for the future as well when it comes to issues of transnational repression, or, what does the Tunisian context looks like now, and what does it mean for all the journalists who are, living in what used to be a somewhat safer place, and, are some people at risk of being extradited back to their home countries in other MENA countries. This is really a cause for concern. Actually, Samia, and before we jump to my next question, I want to remind the audience that we'll have a Q&A right after. So please, if you have a question, you can just drop it in the Q&A section. Samia, you were just mentioning the Universal Periodic Review of Algeria, Morocco, and Tunisia that happened towards the end of last year. And the three countries have actually provided their responses to the recommendations made by other UN member states. Could you actually give us an overview of the relevant findings and recommendations that were made to Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco? And what was the response from the authorities?
Right. So the timing, again, very serendipitous. And TIMEP and CPJ actually both submitted really informative civil society organization reports regarding the UPRs. And I would heavily and highly encourage folks who have not been able to take a look at those fact sheets on the websites to sort of get an understanding of what the broader situation is. But yes, so governments a few months ago relayed their recommendations to Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia. And across the board, similar critiques, similar recommendations. Release journalists, stop arresting journalists, and open up the space. Now, I'm just speaking in the context of press freedom, right? Obviously, the recommendations extended far beyond that regarding human rights and freedom of assembly, and broader reforms towards liberalizing a lot of these very oppressive laws. And in light of the recent submission of the reports, I think it won't surprise folks that these countries across the board, Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia, responded relatively positively to recommendations that were fairly ambiguous and not pointed in terms of dealing specifically with the question of releasing prisoners, stop using terror laws to charge journalists, allow journalists to work freely. And we are seeing instead that they responded relatively positively to recommendations that were not particularly political in nature. So the question of disability rights, women's rights, these very vaguely worded recommendations that don't necessarily get to the heart of what are the issues that we're talking about today. This is also speaks to the general ambivalence, I think, of these governments regarding these questions, because at a time when they are under international scrutiny for their human rights records, across the board, we have seen Morocco and Algeria, Tunisia continue to escalate their crackdown on the very issues that they are being criticized for. And so again, to emphasize the recommendations that were made in general, the ones that were positively embraced by these governments were the ones that were less political, that were more sort of broadly social, vaguely worded, and don't get to the heart of the issues that organizations like TIMEP and CPJ had cited in their initial submissions, along with other civil society groups and the recommendations of other UN member states.
Thank you so much, Samia. So I do understand that you read that as a kind of lack of willingness of these countries to kind of address those issues, as in that they're not very genuine in wanting to address those pressing matters and are merely kind of accepting recommendations that they feel are not too critical, or that they can.
Of course, I mean, and even beyond that, I mean, for a country like Algeria specifically, Algeria out of the three has really been at the center of intention in terms of the escalating crackdown on journalists, not just women. I mean, we're talking in general, Ihsan Qadi, Raouf Farah, a number of activists and journalists who have been this just dramatic escalation in the Algerian authorities' repression and crackdown on journalists and activists, sort of as an extension of those that were involved with the Hirak movement a few years ago. The fact that they started to mount this crackdown in this window between when they were under review and when they were supposed to respond to recommendations tells me more than that it's just ambivalence. It's saying, we really are going to keep doing what we're doing, and we're going to make it worse. And what are you going to do about it? Nothing. And part of the reason for this also with Algeria is because of its massive stockpiled gas resources in light of the Russian-Ukraine crisis, which has prompted all of these countries, usually countries that are fairly critical. For example, France, we had Emmanuel Macron go visit Algeria in a very unprecedented visit, almost begging, right, for these access to these gas resources. And so Algeria really posturing and using that to its advantage. And again, in the context of the UPR saying, not only do we not care, we're going to continue escalating, doing the same thing that you are critiquing us for. And that is a worrying sign.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Samia, for these remarks. Sherif, you touched upon that a little bit earlier, but in light of what we know about the proliferation of the use of surveillance, as we've talked about, and as Samia said, autocrats in the Maghreb continue to learn from each other. How can the international community kind of address the rise of these kind of tool of repressions? Like, what are the ways that we can try to address this problem at a more global, systemic level?
Sure. So we talked about the memorandum that will be put by the UN, EU, and now the US on using spyware that has been abused. And there are ways to punish. The US have already started, for example, blacklisting NSO, the parent company that produces Pegasus, which have caused a lot of problems for the company. But of course, until yesterday, when the Biden administration have made it a rule and have made that across the federal government, it addresses the market problem, not the enforcement problem. And I think enforcement here, like any international topic like this, will take a lot of cooperation internationally and locally with law enforcement. We also need to see that reflected by, for example, the Biden administration could issue an annual report blacklisting companies and making names, naming and shaming companies and countries who continues to engage in abuses of surveillance software. So it's not just once you put it on the financial kind of risk side, but you also make it publicly known And that also could create further repercussions. People like a Moroccan government official would think twice if they found their name on a blacklist internationally, saying that they have abused this software. It will also have repercussions if they continue to produce not just as a kind of a rhetoric. It is also very related to other issues. So alone surveillance is not going to be dealt with any country. It has to be dealt with a coalition led by the US, the EU, and the UN. But also it's very relevant to other forms of censorship and other forms where the US can play a role. This is just the bare minimum to set a standard that we're talking about in order for it to be implemented globally and implemented with consideration to the worst offenders and also to the people who are going to suffer from it the most. It's a long road. Transparency is key. Annual reports, annual blacklisting, and calling out abusers is key. That answer that question?
Sherif. Yeah. Jeje, so I want to turn back to you now. So even if like some of the recommendations that we've talked about are being enacted, be it legal, political, social, this is going to take time. And I'm just wondering if you could tell us like what women can do now to keep themselves safe. And then as another question, what can other stakeholders, like private companies, actually do to try to address those abuses and protect women media professionals on the ground?
Very important questions. Thank you, Inès. The first thing to answer your question about like what can women journalists do, and actually at this point, any journalist or anyone that wants to protect themselves online can do. There are a couple, like we talk about it in different aspects. The first one is to manage your personal and professional data and information online. And with that, we always say, separate the personal and the professional. And when we say that, not necessarily meaning to have 2 Twitter accounts, 2 Instagrams, and 2 like Facebooks. This is not exactly the point, but to be very intentional and cautious about what type of information you're posting in each of these platforms and why. Like if I am using my Instagram, for example, I'm just giving examples to make it easier to think through the information. If I am using my Instagram account for only personal purposes, I tighten my privacy settings very much. My account is private. I know who I have there. So I am not very worried about someone leaking information or someone having access to personal information that could put me and others I care about at risk. For example, I know that a lot of people, like, for example, you can post pictures with your family, pictures with your dog, with the name of your dog, and it seems like an okay thing to do. And I will explain in a minute, like why this is something that is actually risky. And then if I'm using my Twitter account for professional purposes, I make sure not to post any personal information there. I want to acknowledge and repeat, because that was mentioned like a million times so far in this discussion. Yes, government-sponsored attacks, they have a lot of resources. We might not have the ability to mitigate all of the dangers, but we can mitigate some of the dangers. And we can make it harder and harder for regular actors, not necessarily government-sponsored ones, to make it harder for them to find information about us and access information and data about us that would put us in danger. So just differentiating and being very intentional about what am I using my platforms for, what type of information I'm adding there is something very, very crucial. Another thing is regularly review your online accounts. Delete things that you're not using, accounts that you're not using, delete content that you're not using, review any data. I honestly do this like maybe once every 2 to 3 months. I know it seems like a lot, but I know because of my work and like the things that I'm covering or training people on, it puts me in a specific place that I would be worried about the type of information available about me online. Then we always recommend people, these are very technical, so if anyone wants to take notes, it's really helpful even for anyone that is just concerned. Setting up a Google alert for your name is something that is useful, because that means that if your name is mentioned somewhere, you will get an alert so that you can check, where is this being mentioned? Is it something that you consented to? Is it something that is dangerous? Or is it something that is like someone just like saying how good your work is? It's good to see that too, you know. Another thing is to secure your online accounts. And when it comes to securing your online accounts, there are several things that you can do. First, setting up two-factor authentication. We really, 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 really recommend that very much. Imagine your accounts with one lock. Your first lock is your username and password. Then you would want to add another lock in case the first lock broke. So adding 2FA method, two-factor authentication method, is something that secures your accounts very much. And there are several ways of doing that. One of them is to use which is the most used one, is to use your phone number so that you can receive an SMS text on your phone with a PIN that you enter to verify you are the person that is logging in. We do not recommend this one a lot for something called SIM hijacking, or in the context of the US is spoofing. And it happens a lot in the Middle East because it happened to me, which is someone having access to your traffic, your like phone traffic, text messages and phone calls. So if my verification method is an SMS message and someone has access to my phone already, they already have access to my second verification method. The second and third ways of setting up two-factor authentication is to use an authentication app like Google Authenticator or Authy or Do Mobile or something like that. And it's an application that generates random numbers that expire. And this is the secure part about it, is that they're random, but they also expire. So it's harder for someone to have access to that. And the third and the most secure method is to use a physical key, a YubiKey. And this means that only the person with this key will have access to these accounts. Whatever method you decide to use, make sure to save something called the backup codes, which is if you go to set up any two-factor authentication on any platform, they will give you like a backup codes that in case if you lost access to your method, you can access your account. You're not stuck outside. Another thing is to change all your password, create long password, unique to each account, at least 16 characters. And I'm saying unique password means that if I have 20 accounts, I should have 20 different long, complicated passwords, at least 16 characters. I understand that this seems very overwhelming, but there are tools that will help you keep yourself secure and at the same time navigate this easily. For example, password managers. In my opinion, this is like the best invention for security for journalists and human rights activists. And there are free versions, free ones. There is 1Password is free for journalists. So if you want an account, you can send them an email telling them that you are a journalist and you're worried about your security, and they will provide you with a free account. There is Dashlane. There is other ones as well. Another thing that people can also do is to protect themselves from, against spyware. And there is a lot of resources, specifically Reporters Without Borders, CPJ, and Access Now. They provide a lot of good resources on how to do that. But the minimum things that you can do is research. In this case, you don't really need to research because we know that the countries we're talking about are using spyware. So we already know that this is something that they're using. So one of the things that you do, update your devices and applications regularly. Because if an app needs an update, not necessarily always for new features, sometimes it's because there is a breach or there is a problem with their privacy settings and they just don't want to say it publicly. So they hide it in an update, in an application update or a device update. Another thing is, if you are really concerned, perform a factory reset. Factory reset on your phone removes malware and spyware from your device. So like performing a factory reset is something good. And if you are in a high level of risk, you might want to do that regularly, like maybe every couple of months. It's a pain because you lose like anything that you have on that device. But if you are concerned, this is something that you would want to think about. Now, these are some of the things that people can do. Now, to your other question about the different actors and what they can do to tackle the problem of online abuse and online attacks. We work with social media platforms to advocate to have better escalation channels and reporting mechanisms. And what I mean by that is, what is the communication method and route that a person can have if I am facing online abuse and there is a content about me online that I want removed, like my home address? What are the things that I can do? And social media platform would respond in a way that is efficient and helpful. So they definitely, social media platforms are big actors in that. Having a proper escalation channel, having a proper reporting mechanism that people can know what type of information they need to provide. What is the time frame? What is the response expected? And what if it is an emergency? Like, yes, if there is a specific abusive content online, but also there is my home address, I want my home address to be taken down because this is a very high risk. So this is something that social media platforms need to do. There is also another responsibility that falls on newsrooms. Newsrooms should definitely support their journalists and staff when they're struggling with online abuse, whether offering them with some resources, like, for example, like password manager. The least that anyone can do is like provide them with password manager, any type of support. And also the newsroom should understand that a lot of the attacks that their journalists face, it's not random, it is targeted, and it is a threat to the industry and to journalism. I want to give space.
Thank you so much, Jeje. I was literally taking notes as you were speaking, and I think this is always like a useful reminder for all of us, whether journalists or people in the human rights field as well. I think really for anyone, those are very like basic and useful tools that we should try to apply as much as we can. Thank you all so much for these remarks. We already have a couple of questions, so let's jump right in. And actually, the first one I'm thinking I might ask you, Jeje, to enter, because I know the mandate of PEN America is a bit broader. So perhaps you would have an idea of how to respond to that. So the question is, in the age of social media, we have a growing culture of civilian journalism and reporting. They may not necessarily call themselves journalists, but these type of pages and accounts are increasingly responsible for generating the news and information content that so many of the members of the public depend on. The person is wondering how these more informal journalists fit into the conversation that we're having, and as many wouldn't necessarily have institutional cover and support or formal training in reporting ethics. Have you seen a difference between the risk and consequences being faced by informal and formal professional formal journalists? Jeje, I'll let you take it, but of course,
Sure.
Samia, Sherif, if you have some additional remarks, feel free to jump in as well.
Sure, thank you. This is a really important question, and that's true. Like the mandate of PEN America, we work with journalists, writers, artists, and human rights defenders. So it's a very big group of people in general and professions. And the discussion about a professional journalist and citizen journalism, it's an ongoing discussion. I don't think it will ever stop. But the thing is, we believe that protections should be for everyone. We believe that everyone should feel safe online to express their views and share information. This is a general response. For the region that we're talking about, North Africa, the Maghreb, and even Egypt, actually registering as a journalist is something very, very hard to do. Specifically, if you are, like, for example, in my case, I was covering human rights abuses in Egypt. I am not going to the government telling them, hey, look at this, I am covering human rights abuses and torture in prisons. Can you please register me? It's very hard. And like navigating this conversation really differs from a country to another, from a region to another. Do we have like any protection methods in general and acceptance of journalism that we can actually go and register our, like in Niqaba and all of these things in the syndicate? Not really necessarily in all countries. So the conversation is big, but what we believe in is everyone should feel safe to speak. Everyone should be safe that they want to share information, they should. In the context of the Maghreb and North Africa and the Middle East, these citizen journalists are actually a very important source of information. And we can see a lot of like defamation campaigns and like smearing campaigns against them and saying that they're not actually real journalists. But who to decide? You know what I mean? Like in the US, you can go and register yourself as a journalist with so many different things, a freelance journalist and all of that. If we're not even talking about citizen journalists, if we're talking about freelance journalists, they do not have support for the most part of institutions, but they are journalists and they are not full-timers with anyone, but they are also treated similarly that, you know what, you don't have the backing of anyone, but at the same time, you're doing the work that is extremely dangerous. I hope this answers your question.
Yeah, I'd love to also jump in because I have my own personal experience. I mean, when I was reporting with Reuters for Morocco, for example, I never got my press credentials. So according to the Moroccan authorities, I wasn't a journalist, but here I am with my full-time contract with a major international news agency. I would definitely reiterate what Jeje said. There's so many obstacles that prevent journalists from being able to be legally considered journalists. And this is the unintended or perhaps intended consequence of this is twofold. One, it gives the authorities sort of that cover to say, well, we're going to prosecute you based off of this law, not the press code, because you're not a journalist, because you don't have the press credentials. And we've seen this happen. And the other is that there is the sort of space that gives that journalist more room to operate. It's a little bit more sort of less restricted, but it comes with a greater risk because you can you don't have to necessarily go through those procedures of, what formally press accredited journalists have to. That is to say, again, it comes with the risks. So this question of citizen media is so important. And I would say that at least in the way that I have been approaching this conversation, I have been incorporating those folks that work in that field in mind and how I've been responding to questions and framing things, because I myself came from that background of, going from being a blogger to a citizen media journalist to being a formally, published journalist. And I know many others that have gone through that trajectory. But here's the other thing is that in the absence of a free press, which is the situation that we're looking at in the Maghreb, that citizen media becomes sort of the primary source of important and critical information. And whether or not the state likes it or other organizations question it, it doesn't change the reality that they are an important source of information. And so they should always be part of the conversations we're having when we're talking about press freedom in countries and regions where there is none.
Thank you so much, Samia. And I'm actually curious to get your thoughts on the dynamics between local and foreign journalists. Like, are they targeted differently on the ground? Are the tactics any different?
Yeah, so they are targeted just about as equally, at least in my understanding in the cases that I have seen across the Maghreb. What foreign journalists have is foreign citizenship, which allows them to just simply be deported. For the most case, we don't see them prosecuted, as opposed to local, national journalists. They have that risk, right? They do face the prosecution. They can't just simply be deported. But in general, foreign journalists are targeted just as much as local journalists. And whether it's also through surveillance, also through defamation, harassment. And this is also the same for the women foreign journalists. Again, these issues don't simply go away, but what foreign journalists tend to have that their local counterparts don't is that protection of being a foreign citizen, which just, oftentimes that entails authorities just arresting them or forcing them to literally sit on the airplane and leave. I know of several cases in which this happened to colleagues of mine in Morocco, where they were personally escorted to their flights, taken their passports confiscated, forced to pack their bags. and leave the country because of their reporting or because of where they were reporting. This is not even, they haven't even gotten to the stage of actually publishing what they were working on. If you were simply at the wrong place, according to the authorities. This is especially the case when we were talking about the Hirak protests in Morocco in the Northern Reef region in 2016-17. And as always is the case in Morocco when it comes to the Western Sahara, any journalist caught there is almost automatically always sent away.
Thank you, Samia. And actually, we have another question from the Q&A that maybe I can direct to you and or Sherif regarding the increased trend and use of morality laws to silence critics in Morocco. And the question is there a reason the Moroccan government is shifting to the use of these laws? And have we seen a difference in public response to these accusations against journalists?
I think Samia have already touched upon some of the cases. Hajar Raisuni was one of them. But I think the first time for me, and I've been with CPJ for a while, I think the case of Hisham Mansouri, maybe 7 years ago, was the first time I was like, what is this? What is happening here? Why Morocco is using adultery as a charge? And it is something that I'm used to in other contexts, in other countries in our region, something that you will find used not in court or in prosecution office everywhere in our region. You'll find it even enforced in many ways, but for Morocco, that wasn't the case. And I think that shows the shift that they were trying to figure out a way to silence this kind of reporting. It was reporting about corruption. It was reporting about the government use of surveillance. And at the time, they forced him into prosecution, and he is now in exile since. Same way that happened with Samia and others who have been pushed into exile. Yeah, you can be silenced, you can threaten, maybe not jailed, but sent away. Many cannot go back. And I think the surveillance issue has its hand in so many ways, because we see it in Morocco even before the recent wave. We're talking about Pegasus in Morocco, but before them, they were just using old school 19th century surveillance, video cameras, going behind your car with cars going door to door. Like, this continues to exist. It didn't go away. And it's not just used against journalists who have a membership in a syndicate or even are approved to be international journalists by media regulators. It's anyone that we think in our definition when we think about a journalist who engages in journalism, the practice of gathering and disseminating information and commentary about issues of public interest. So it's a common sense approach. We try to use that when we discuss who is a journalist and who's not. And part of it are the person being in trouble or targeted because of their work, not just because they are called journalists. So they are engaging in that process of journalism.
I would also add to what Sherif said. I mean, using these morality charges also has the intention of tarnishing the reputation of these individuals. And you're hitting two birds with one stone. One, you are bypassing any accusations that you are prosecuting a journalist, because you can say, well, we're not prosecuting them for press code violations. They're actually in the penal code. But more importantly, you are giving basically the public fodder to continue not just supporting this, but in these societies that are overwhelmingly conservative, to go after journalists for morality, sex-related charges, is to say, here is the target on your back. Now what was initially a state-sponsored campaign of abuse now becomes widespread, because part of the intention is to tarnish the image and the reputation and to engage in the character assassination of these journalists, as if they are the only ones, right? That the only site of a sexual abuse that is taking place in these countries is within this sphere, which is something that is obviously not the case. But I think that's also another very important point to think of how and why these morality crimes are being used to target journalists.
One quick addition to that answer is to just highlight the gender and intersectionality lens when it comes to the morality, like using morality as a thing, is that it sends a signal that women are already discriminated against societally and in the culture. And like whatever is passed and allowed for men is not the same for women. So it actually sends a signal that this is something that will ruin your life, not only professionally, but also personally and within your whatever you're living.
Absolutely. I agree with all of your points. And I think ultimately, as you said, Samia, it's a way also for the authorities to say, well, we're not prosecuting these individuals because of their work as a journalist. And we've seen this also from the more like kind of human rights NGO advocacy perspective. I think the idea is also behind that is to make it harder for us to say, well, they're being targeted for their work as journalists. And I think this is also the kind of rationale behind the weaponization of women's rights as well, or the accusations being made against some journalists, very serious allegations of rape or sexual harassment, because it also makes us all like very uncomfortable. But I think this is precisely why they're using those. And Human Rights Watch did a very good report on that topic, on Morocco specifically. So very, very concerning trend. Sherif, the next one is for you. We have a question. Why did it make sense for the US to develop an annual blacklist? We're talking, about the diffusion and abuse of spyware and surveillance technology. While it makes sense for the US to develop an annual blacklist, how would the US and European partners credibly respond to autocrats' likely criticism that they too suppress journalists and spy on citizens since 9/11? What domestic reforms and diplomatic obstacles would the Biden admin and other EU governments need to overcome to realize this?
Well, these are valid criticism. When I was first surveilled or known that I've read my own personal emails, it was because a UK-based company have worked with Egyptian national security to spy on my Skype conversation. The US government have worked directly with the Emirates to develop their own program to abuse and surveil journalists and activists, including family members of Khashoggi. Several members of national security team in the US were hired as mercenaries to Gulf countries to provide these skills. Of course, these criticisms are valid, and the US, the European governments, including France, who've provided these software's capacity to Egyptian and other governments who have a record of abusing it, knowingly that they are going to be abused, should be held accountable. And that's, I think, the important part. These governments should live up to their failures so far and their complicity so far before they can talk about taking a leadership role. And I think making those annual lists is also a message to their own citizens here, not to engage in these practices. Because many of those contractors, they were like, oh, we didn't know. After we've done with services, we can just go, and maybe they're not going to use it, but they're going to use China or Russia. So why not us? We need to make an example. We need to make up to these examples before we can lecture others. And we need to make sure it's not just the US, European countries, and every country with the capacity to produce these tools. I'll stop here.
Thank you, Sherif, for sharing your thoughts. Perhaps the last question, as we're coming close to the end of this session, and that one would be for Samia. So the question, I'm curious, why is the UN report vague? Why does it not use information like what CPJ has? Be specific about, I guess, making recommendations to release certain specific journalists. These attacks on these journalists are a violation. So the question is, what are the consequences for those states under review if they just ignore the UN report? So the recommendations that were made, what's going to happen?
So just to clarify, the recommendations that were made were very specific, right? It was their responses of the states that was relatively vague, or choosing the relatively vague ones to adopt, right? And, conveniently ignoring the more pointed critical ones. So just to clarify what I'm referring to when I say vague. But in terms of the consequences, the consequences most immediately for a country to just adopt the recommendations that are more vaguely worded or not so politically charged is simply that, they can say, for the record, we heard you, we listened, we don't agree. Simply that. The other is that, these questions will come up again the next time they're under review, which is, I believe, in 4 years. And it'll just be the cycle of bringing up again the same critiques, the same recommendations every 4 years, which has oftentimes and unfortunately been the case. The UN, the UPR process for our intents and purposes, I think serves most importantly as a historical record. It serves as this consolidated source of information that says we have taken note of these abuses. We have mentioned, we are bringing up the names of these individuals that have been targeted for their work. They're going to be part of the historical record. And in and of itself, just that is a major, help for the work that we do as, those of us that work in policy or human rights or advocacy, to have that documentation. Now, in terms of the accountability, that is honestly up to, how these corporations like Jeje mentioned, or how these states like Sherif mentioned, take those questions up to a level beyond just simply, condemnations and resolutions, but actual policy actions.
Thanks a lot, Samia. And I want to be mindful of everybody's time and thank everyone warmly for your contributions. This has been a great, fascinating, intellectually stimulating conversation. So I want to thank the three of you for making the time today. And I hope we can continue the conversation perhaps in other more informal ways later on. And again, I want to thank TIMEP and Audrey for the always wonderful organization of these events and bringing us together.
Yeah, thank you so much, Samia, Jeje, Sherif, for such an important conversation. Thank you, Inès, for beautifully moderating this discussion. I want to let everyone know this conversation is part of a larger commitment and body of work by TIMEP and partners to document and advocate for the safety of journalists across the region. And you can read more about press freedom in the Maghreb by exploring TIMEP's joint alternative civil society reports we submitted ahead of the UPR, and some fact sheets we've compiled on press freedom in Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia that are on TIMEP's website, which I've also shared in the chat here. You can also follow TIMEP on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn, as well as each of our wonderful panelists that you've heard speak here today to follow us and stay engaged with our work. I want to also especially thank these panelists, given how difficult it was to organize this conversation, which I think speaks to how much it matters. It was incredibly difficult to find. We have a network of women journalists that we know across the Maghreb region, and it was incredibly difficult to find those who felt safe for good reason speaking out about this. So an extra thank you to our panelists for, making this happen and being willing to speak about this. To our audience, thank you so much for joining us and contributing so much to the discussion with your insightful questions. Your questions make these conversations so much richer. And a huge thank you to the TIMEP team who made this event possible. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.